When you first look at the Lian Li Q58 Mini ITX chassis and compare it to the image on the box, it looks like a conventional small form factor case that's normal. 90-degree angles everywhere, compact and boxy. Then, when you remove the top cover and open the panels, it looks exactly like the image on the back of the box, which is absolutely bonkers and like nothing I've ever seen before. These 4 half doors can be fairly easily removed. The glass at the top is assisted with the screw. The bottom panels just pull away. And then you see we have a dual chamber design, so power supply and motherboard in this side and graphics card in this side. Vertical graphics card mounting with a PCI Express riser. It's also worth pointing out that this Q58 is specifically the Q58X4. 4 different versions with 4 different prices. So the black with the Gen 3 riser is $120 internationally. With the Gen 4 riser, $150. White with the Gen 3 riser, add-on 10 to $130. White with the Gen 4 riser is $160. Humorously, Lian Li tells us those are international prices, although they're in dollars. For America, you need to add another $10 to that price. So that would make this $160 US. I'm going to say it's going to be £150 here in the UK, but right now I don't honestly know. So, Mini ITX, unusual design, PCI Express Gen 4 riser. And if you want to see unusual, look at this. At the back, it's a PWM and RGB fan hub. I mean, blimey, I've literally never seen anything like that in my life. I know what you're thinking, those half doors, Leo, what are they all about? Show us those again. Okay, we've got pivot pins top and bottom on both sides. This is the motherboard power supply side. Let us take the glass panels. Slide those on from the back, like so. And then if we take the other glass panel, and there we go. And now the main side has glass top and bottom, which means that obviously we need to use these 2 mesh panels on the graphics side of things. The 2 thumb screws you saw me removing initially, you can use those in these holes because the glass panels otherwise are inclined to drop. In this configuration, you've got mesh on the graphics side and glass on the more interesting side, or we can go back to how we were before. Glass at the top, mesh at the bottom, glass at the top, mesh at the bottom. That gives us a number of options to play with. That's certainly an unusual idea. Something else, if we turn to the accessory pack that is interesting, is an alternate top bracket. This case can accommodate a number of options when it comes to storage. Also, it supports either ATX power or SFX. ATX power really reduces your options, but you're not surprised to hear that, I'm sure, because an ATX power supply essentially fills this part of the chassis. However, if you switch over to an SFX, you get a great many more options. The best thing to do is to remove the panels again and swap the brackets around and see what we can install in each configuration. Main hardware I've installed here, we have a Gigabyte B450i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi motherboard with a Ryzen 7 5800X 8-core processor, Sabrent Rocket 4.0 SSD M.2 and some Trident Z Neo RGB memory. Turning to the back of the chassis, or I suppose the other side of the chassis more accurately, we have a Sapphire RX 6800 XT graphics card, which has plenty of space to spare here, And you'll note this is a dual slot graphics card and it's a triple slot chassis. So that goes in with no difficulty whatsoever. You will also note I appear to have lost the I/O shield for the B450i motherboard, which is really rather annoying. Turning back to the main compartment, we have the power supply, which is a Seasonic Focus GX650. So ATX 650 watt gold rated, and it fills a good chunk of this side of the chassis. This has a number of knock-ons to my mind. The first is it has to be installed with the fan on the outside. So if you decided you wanted all glass on this side and all mesh on the side with the graphics, I'm not 100% certain at this second how well the power supply would breathe. Secondly, you are reducing your options for CPU cooling and also for storage, because the two things are kind of interrelated. You could install an air cooler on the processor. If we take this Noctua with a rather lengthy name, NHL9X65, and this is the AM4 version, as you can see, although I haven't removed the little stock plastic brackets from the motherboard because I'm not actually installing the cooler. But if magnetic dust filters dropped off the bottom. If I simply offer up the cooler, basically like so, it would go in it would be tight. And again, therefore, if we're up against glass on this side, that'd be problematic. So we're going to end up with, we don't want to choke the graphics card either, so we're going to end up with that half glass, half mesh configuration. And at this stage, I'll be saying to myself, I want full mesh on both sides because both sides are going to have to breathe. So air cooler would work. The alternative is you put in a 120mm AIO, which is going to go in this space here. So pump on processor and then going up to the top of the chassis. And then we come to storage. So we've got M.2 on the motherboard. You may not be aware, I actually have a 2.5-inch SSD already installed. There's a caddy just there. If I pull off this front panel, which is rather a nifty piece of hardware, just pops loose. And out with this SanDisk 2.5-inch SSD. That is built in. If you want to give yourself extra space for hardware, you can remove that caddy. Alternatively, or additionally actually, there we have a hatch. And there we have a bracket that can either take a 120mm fan or an SSD, which would go like so. In addition to M.2 storage, I could put an SSD there, an SSD there, an air cooler there, maybe, or 120 AIO there. There are options with an ATX power supply, but it doesn't look like a brilliant idea to me. Much better, in my opinion, to switch over to SFX. Swapping out the ATX Focus Gold for a significantly smaller SFX Focus Gold gives us loads more space inside the Q58, in particular in the top of the case. We've now got the ability to install some proper cooling. We can put either a 240 or a 280 AIO in the roof of the case. Admittedly, that's because I've removed this bracket, which can be used for installing, say, more storage. But with the top fully open, we now have the option of proper cooling, and we've still got loads of airflow available for the graphics card. This has the potential to give us the best of both worlds. A compact ITX case that supports a full-size graphics card but with proper cooling. Fractal Designs Celsius Plus S24 Prisma, another way of saying 240mm Ace Tech with RGB. And that is the cooler installed in the top bracket. Arctic MX5 thermal compound on the Ryzen 7, and then we lower the cooler installation through the top of the case and the bracket drops into place. It's a bit close for comfort at the front where the tubes are sitting right above the power supply and the main power plug. Line things up carefully and screw the top bracket with the cooler down tight. Final stage is to install the pump and block. Now we just connect up the pump and the RGB. It's clear we have very little space to play with inside the chassis, and these coolant hoses are causing me a certain amount of concern because they're going to have to obviously go inside the chassis. Let's hope those side panels hold the hoses in. To my eyes, the finished build in the Q58X4 looks really appealing. The split panels, so glass at the top, mesh at the bottom, the way I've got it organised, looks really good. You can see the RGB through both the mesh and the glass, but you get just an interesting effect going on. And because of the dual chamber design, we've got graphics on this side, and then on the other side you've got the liquid cooler and the RGB on the RAM. The way I see it is there are a couple of key design criteria that Lian Li set for the Q58. The first being to support a full-length triple slot graphics card, and the second being to make it as small as they reasonably could. And in that context they've succeeded, no argument whatsoever. But all sorts of consequences and problems, and I suppose benefits as well, flow from those 2 points. Clearly, if you have a full-fat graphics card, which in this day and age is going to cost you a load of money, it's going to draw a load of power, it's going to produce a load of heat, it's going to deliver loads of performance. It makes no sense if you don't use a decent processor along with your full-fat graphics card. But on the other hand, if you put in a baby graphics card in this case that can support a full-length triple slot graphics card, that's going to be a bit peculiar. So you have to push towards the higher end of the scale. This Ryzen 7 5800X I've chosen is probably about as low as you want to go in terms of processors. You could go for a 6-core Ryzen 5 or Core i5 of course, but 8 cores is a perfectly reasonable choice. You take those two components in this case, an RX 6800 XT graphics card and a Ryzen 7 5800X, and then you've got a lot of hardware. You've got 500 watts of power draw, in fact 530 watts at the wall socket, and you've got stonking performance that you have to keep cool. And yet building the PC and cooling the PC is problematic. Cable management is painful. You just basically have to push the cables in the center of the case and try and keep them out of the way of everything important. You can't really tie the cables to anything, there's nothing to tie them to. And similarly, the hoses or tubes for the all-in-one cooler are also really difficult. Now, it's entirely possible if you switch to a different all-in-one rather than this specific Fractal, you might find you've got hoses that are slightly more flexible and that you can route slightly more easily. But the very fact most all-in-ones are built for at least a mid-tower chassis, if not a full tower chassis, when you put them in a mini ITX small form factor, you've got excess stuff. You've got excess cables for your power supply, you've got excess tubing for your all-in-one. Custom looping this is a non-starter in my opinion. An air cooler could work, as I showed you with the Noctua, but I think it'd be problematic. Adding an extra fan in the floor of the case, yes, I'm sure you could do it. As to how well it would work, I'm not entirely sure. There's another thing. I'm thinking I'm going to revisit the Q58 in a second video because this case supports a 280mm all-in-one, and I simply could not get a 280 to go in this chassis. I put the question into Lian Li. For testing, I did my usual thing of combining Cinebench R23 and TimeSpy stress test, which, as I say, pushes past 500 watts of system power draw. The system just about survived the experience. I ran the fans initially in silent mode, which is 1000 RPM in this particular instance. It was very quiet. However, cooling was not marvellous. The processor was at 90 degrees. Remember, the charts show you deltas. And the graphics temperature was 77 degrees. The significant thing here probably is the processor was running at 4.25 gigahertz, drawing 124 watts. So the processor, to my mind, was throttling slightly. When I ramped the fans up to 1500 RPM, it became slightly noisier, but was still very quiet. Temperatures barely changed. The processor came down a degree, the graphics came down 2 degrees. However, the processor was now running at 4.45 gigahertz and the full 142 watts. So that little bit of extra fan speed pulled the system into the realms of full performance. It was delivering the goods in either form, but it just helped it along the way. Opening the panels fully took a couple of degrees off the temperatures, but didn't make a lot of difference. But then to my mind, we've got a lot of mesh going on, and the case actually breathes well. The biggest problem is all those blooming cables and the hoses or tubes for the liquid cooler. Let us turn to my pros and cons. We'll start with the cons, the bad points. Cable management is difficult. Well, yes, it is. It's actually horrible. Installing an all-in-one means you have to find a path for the coolant tubes, so essentially the same point twice. You have to remove this top panel before you can gain access to the SSD caddy or open the side panels. It's really quite aggravating. I appreciate it's the sort of thing you probably won't do very often once you've built the system, but during the course of this review, that's really started to get on my nerves. And I think that some people want to see a version of the Q58 that is full mesh, i.e. mesh on both sides rather than having any glass at all. And it's entirely possible that some people will want glass fully on both sides. I'm not in that camp myself, but I can imagine this would be true. So this, the way they're selling it at the moment, with 2 of the 4 panels being glass, 2 of the 4 being mesh, to my mind, fine, but I think more options will be required. Then we have the pros, the good points. Stylish good looks, particularly these interesting split panels. I like the way this case looks. I think it's really nifty. The Q58 X4 and W4 support PCI Express Gen 4. Yes, you're paying for the privilege, but the fact they have a genuine Gen 4 riser that has behaved flawlessly is a big thumbs up for me. You have support for a full-length triple slot graphics card. Yes, you do. Now that in turn, as I said before, brings problems potentially. You certainly have to give it huge consideration, but it does it. Not just full length dual slot, full length triple slot. Well done, Lian Li. And then the clever design allows you to choose between SFX and ATX power. If you go down the ATX route, I think you're going to really struggle. SFX makes this case work so much better, but you can absolutely run on ATX. So again, well done, Lian Li. There we have it. It's a complicated little case. There's lots of nuance to it. I do, however, on balance, think it's worth buying. It's an 8 out of 10. I do think I shall revisit it, in particular with a view to looking at a 280 all-in-one and very possibly that Noctua air cooler.